semester. We're going to be kicking it off with this lovely resolution right here. This House believes that the American experiment has failed. We're going to be welcoming our speakers. Affirming the resolution, we are going to be having Jerry Johnson. He is a communications major. Sarah Lynn Nelson, current Vice President of Veritas Society. Josh Yashuda is going to be affirming. I don't know how to pronounce his name. And then Alex McKenna. All right, just so for those individuals who are not familiar with the Delmox debates and the sort of public forum format, it's going to be starting off with 6-minute speeches presented by these presenters. There are going to be one question each directly after each of their speeches, and then we're going to be moving into the open floor speeches. So those are going to be 5 minutes each. Anyone from the audience is welcome to present, and then if you wish to field a question, it will be a single question afterwards. We'll then be having a brief redirect by Mr. McNamara. I don't know where he went, but oh, right there. And then we'll be entering into the lightning round of speeches, 2 minutes each, and then we'll sort of go from there, probably move into a vote. I think that's how this thing usually goes. So, welcoming the current head of debates, who is actually going to be chairing today's debate, Mr. Alex Fielder.
Hello and welcome. If everyone would please rise for an opening prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven,
Hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen.
St. Thomas Aquinas, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Amen. We will now hear our first speech from the affirming side. That will be Mr. Jerry Johnson.
This works? Okay. So, hi everybody. When I was preparing for this debate, the number one question that people had and I had was, what the heck is the American experiment? It's such a, and I feel like I know what it means, but it's so vague and so vast of a term for such a vast nation that you can kind of put any term or any definition you want, because anything America does, the way that it came onto the national or the global scene from the very beginning, set a lot of precedents. But I think that the best way to define the American experiment is taking the principles of the preamble, where to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and promote the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. To take those ideas and fit them somehow to operate a nation as big as America, even when it was just 13 colonies. Each of those colonies was like the size of a European country. It's a beast of a nation. And you have to find some way of making that work. And what the founders decided upon was a republic. And a republic they picked because they looked at all of the theoretical models and actual examples of governments throughout history and figured out, human nature is unavoidable. And I'm not here to argue that human nature caused America to fail necessarily, because that's the cause of every government's failure. But I am here to say that America was founded as a republic in order to balance out the worst instincts of the few and the many, the two directions from which tyranny can come. The few can, or actually the many, can mitigate the worst impulses of the few by just voting them out because of the democratic processes inherent to our democratic republic. The few can mitigate the worst tendencies of the many by the Republican principle of common good. Both the people, the culture, and the elected leaders are striving for the common good, an agreed upon definition of what is good for our nation. We find that in the preamble. The problem is that we really don't have that anymore. Like, our democracy. You constantly hear about the fact that America is a democracy and Trump is ruining our democracy and our democracy will die in darkness. But we don't really have a democracy. We have democratic principles to support our republic. We don't even, part of the thing that supports the common good is a culture of virtue, a culture of religion. My colleague Nelson's going to expound on that. But we definitely don't have that. I would argue we don't even have a culture anymore. We have a bunch of subgroups, all compete with competing definitions of the good, trying to make theirs dominant. It's faction, and it's exactly what the founders, specifically Madison, absolutely despised. And then, on the side of the government, we don't even really have a republic anymore because we've lost this conception of the common good. Our elected leaders, though they are elected by democratic processes, even though that's kind of under doubt now, given recent events, they are all serving themselves, the elite. They're serving their own purposes of power and domination, growing their wealth, growing their global influence by means of international finance and military dominance. America is essentially a bit of an empire now, ironic given how we originated, trying to throw off imperial chains. And, we don't have that anymore. Like, can you, and anybody identify any sense of common good? Do we even trust our leaders to be working for us? Like, as a democracy, we insist upon our leaders working for the good of the people, which, people aren't inherently good just because they're the people, but they don't care about us. The American government is no longer about, it's not for the people, it's not by the people, it's not about the people in the slightest. It's just to its own ends. And because of the size, because of the desire for power and dominance, America has become a bit of an empire. It wants to spread its influence across the world, or the elites do anyways. That's not necessarily what the people want. It's what happened with Britain. It's what happened with Rome, and those comparisons to the Roman Republic are a bit tired, but it's very true. We're not about our principles. The experiment was, can we apply those principles to this land so diverse, so vast, and clearly that hasn't really worked. There's a story from the very end of the Roman Republic. Scipio the Younger, he was responsible for defeating Carthage, and Carthage was utterly destroyed, and he wept. Scipio wept as he saw this, and his friend Polybius, a historian, asked him, we won the battle, what are you doing? And he's saying, well, Rome has lost its moral mandate. It's no longer about, please conclude. And that's kind of where we find ourselves. We've abandoned our principles and therefore have failed.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Jared, actually, we'll be now able to answer one question from anybody in the audience if we have any questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, stand up.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess Mr. Willett.
I appreciate your definition of American experiment. Can you clarify your definition?
So I think part of the experiment is, can we hold to common good? That's the point of the Republic, it's the point of the Constitution, it's the point of making natural rights essential to our nation. And if we fail to uphold that, if culture fractures, if, as it has, if the government fails to serve that common good, I believe that the experiment has failed, because that was the experiment, to see if that could work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson. We are now going to hear a presentation from Mr. McKenna, opposing the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Steeldenner. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do establish and ordain this Constitution of the United States of America. I hope that we all at least have an understanding of the Constitution to know that that's from the preamble. And these are the principles, the structure that we, against the resolution, will be holding today. And I'm sure in your mind there are two primary questions. What is the American experiment? And what constitutes a failure? We on the opposing side have a definition of the American experiment as a stable democratic republic that enshrines liberty and law. And based off of that, we have to ask the question, does the American United States today constitute a democratic republic that enshrines liberty and law? The second question is, what defines a failure? We believe that a failure in this case means a nation that is doomed to fail by the principles that are upheld in its governing documents. In this case, the governing documents that we will be talking about today are obviously the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So, we then go forward into this debate with these two questions, which I hope I have answered at least in some way or shape or form in your mind, with 5 criteria by which to determine whether or not the United States has failed. Those 5 criteria are held within our preamble. As of course we must expect, if this is an experiment, there was a methodology for the experiment. There were actors for the experiment. There was an expected or desired conclusion for the experiment. There was a hypothesis. This hypothesis of our founding fathers was that a stable democratic republic could survive enshrining liberty and law. And there are 5 criteria that will determine whether or not that is the case. Number 1, establishing justice. Number 2, ensuring domestic tranquility. Number 3, providing for the common defense. Number 4, promoting the common good, promoting the general welfare. And number 5, securing the blessings of liberty. My partner is going to expound upon each of those criteria in much greater detail given the minimal amount of time I have in this speech, but let's go over them in brief. Firstly, we have the establishment of justice. In no other nation do you see the justice system that we have, the due process that we have, the ability for a trial by our peers of anyone who's convicted of a crime. Dozens of countries throughout the world do not have the writ of habeas corpus, the very ability to be charged and know what they are charged of when being held in confinement. Secondly, we have ensuring domestic tranquility. I think, unfortunately, most of us here have not been to any third world countries. I know I haven't. I know some of us here, like Mr. McNamara, have been to many, and have seen the scourge of civil war, and have seen the scourge of governments that call themselves democratic or call themselves republics. That third point, providing for the common defense. The nearest country next to the United States that puts money into their military is China. And we have a military budget that is twice that. Not to just simply look at numbers though, I think it is obvious from the fact that we have had no wars on our soil since the Civil War. All of them have been foreign wars. And that we have been able to defend ourselves, hold our boundaries steadfast against any sort of invader that would try. Next, we have ensuring the general welfare of the people. Again, I think that we can see here that we in America live a pretty nice life. We can take a look at the Gentile Gallery, for example. It's a pretty nice building. Now, of course, this is not representative of all of America, but for any of us who have done some basic traveling throughout the country, as a general rule, things are pretty nice here. And our founding fathers have been able to make sure through the principles enshrined in law that that is the case. Finally, though, and perhaps most importantly, is liberty. What makes all of the other principles work? What makes the United States tick? It is the fact that we, each of us here, have the choice to choose the right or to choose the wrong. We have the freedom enshrined and controlled by justice in law to do what is good or what is evil. If we do what is evil, we are punished. We go to jail. If we do what is right, we are able to blossom. There is a reason why this is called the land of opportunity.
1 minute remaining.
A reason why this is the land of immigrants. A reason why America was founded in order not to legislate the good on others, but to give the people the chance to choose the good. That is the secret to the American dream. That is the secret to why America has survived the over 240 years that it has. And that is the primary reason why this House believes that the American experiment has not failed. That the American experiment has, in fact, succeeded on every criteria that has been applied to it and more. We can look at moral dilemmas. We can look at the abortion rate, the euthanasia. We can look at all of these. But at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves the question, was that enshrined in the Constitution or enshrined in the hearts of people today? Thank you.
Do we have a question for Mr. McKenna? Yes, you, sir.
Sorry. Okay, so I understand. All right, let me put it this way. Are you comparing America's success to the success of other nations, or are you comparing America's success based on theory? So, are you judging the success of America based on other nations?
So I'm judging America's success based upon what we have been able to enshrine in law. Are we a stable democratic republic, and have we enshrined liberty in law? It's not a question of the merits per se. It's a question of, has the structure given the people the freedom to choose the right? And that's where the comparison of other government comes in, where you see, for example, the French Republic, which was founded on the heels of the American Revolution. They've had 5 different governments since that first revolution, right? And we've had one. Sorry?
So the answer is yes, then. We are comparing our success based on other countries.
No, I would say that that's simplifying it too much, because the success is based off of liberty enshrined in law. That can then be embellished by comparing our success to other countries' failures. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McKenna. Next, we will hear our second speech, affirming the motion, from Ms. Nelson.
Thank you. I very much hope that we all have somewhat of an impression of what the American experiment is, though I have a feeling our sides tend to differ a little bit in our definition. I would challenge the other side, the opposing side, in that as such a blessing it is to have liberty, all of these things enshrined in law. All of this is meaningless if it's not actualized in the people. What use is it to have liberty enshrined in law if we're chained by the immorality of our culture? Now, the first dilemma we face in the failure of the American experiment is that of relativism versus our inalienable rights. Now, by relativism, I mean the idea of liberty that we have in our country. Liberty can be stipulatively defined as the ability to believe what we wish and choose what we ought to do. But because America is not, has not submitted itself under a god of a religion, from where does it get the authority to give us these inalienable rights? We have the rights of free speech, of the ability to think freely, the ability to choose our religion. We have these rights. However, if we're not acknowledging that there's a God and that there is an objective objective morality, and that there's a God, if we're not acknowledging these things, from where does the authority to endow these rights come from? If not from God, then that means America is placing itself as a supreme authority to decide what is objectively good and what is objectively wrong. Now, as you can probably tell, there's a danger in this, right? If we have a nation deciding what is objectively good and what is objectively wrong, it's not that big of an issue if you have a virtuous populace. It's not that big of an issue if we elect representatives who submit themselves under God and who submit themselves under true morality, which is unmovable, because God is the one who decides that, not people. However, if you have an unvirtuous populace and an unvirtuous representatives, hypothetically, they could maybe say that convenience is above a child's life. Hypothetically, they could say that. So that's the first dilemma, is that this liberty that we have, this freedom, is all based around America's ability to claim that we have the supreme authority to determine what is right and what is wrong. I'm very grateful for the opposing side laying out those 5 points of the preamble. And I'd like to delve deeply into them and talk about the realization of those ideals. Because if you have this ideal, this government of America and the way it's set up and the laws and all of that, but if it's not realized, it's all meaningless. All right, first we have establishing justice. Yes, we have the justice system, but I'm from Oregon. I'm about 45 minutes away from Portland. And everybody in those protests, which happened more than 60 days in my city, burning down our streets, burning down the federal building, they all said, justice! Justice is what we're fighting for, justice! Is this what America thinks is justice? And if we're subjective in our view of what justice is this what justice is? Is justice whatever the people decide is justice? If we're not rooted in the law of God? What is justice? What is established justice if we're not under the law of God? Secondly, we have common defense, defense of the masses. If we're not defending the weakest among us, who are we defending? The strong don't need defending. Tell me, if we are not pro-life, how are we defending ourselves? How are we defending ourselves?
1 minute.
And that is enshrined in law. The fact that we're not pro-life is enshrined in law. How is that defending ourselves? The other ones are the general welfare, the common good. We already talked about common good a little bit with Jared. How can we have a common good if everybody disagrees on what the common good is? Right now, our representatives are fighting against one another constantly because it's no longer about the common good. Now it's about interest groups. What do they want and what do they want and what do I want? It's no longer a common good. It's constant fighting among interest groups. Basically, the American principles on which America has
15 seconds.
Thank you. The principles on which America has been built have been abandoned. These ideals that we talk about, these things enshrined in law, it's all great and good to talk about and to defend, but if they're not actualized, it's all meaningless. Thank you.
Do you have any questions for Ms. Nelson? Yes, ma'am.
Your opponent clearly defined both what they meant by the American experiment and what it meant for it to fail. Can you do either of those things?
Yes, of course. By the American experiment, I would say that the American experiment is whether a people who are not united under a common religion, not united under a common ethnicity, not united under a common customs, whether they can come together and believe in a common creed That being one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. That would be the American experiment. Its failing would be the people not living up to the principles on which America was based.
Thank you, Ms. Nelson. Now we will hear our final speech. Opposing the motion for Mr. Judy.
Thank you. Never tell how these things are. I just want to start with two things that I think we need to remember. The first is that the failing of the individual does not equal the failing of the nation. And the second is that failing does not equal failure. I'll get to this a little bit more later. So I think we need to go back through the points that we brought up earlier, the 5 points that we were basically judging this entire thing off of. And these are the 5 points brought up under the preamble of the Constitution. The first one we'll start with is justice. And are we creating a system that is just for the people, that the people can understand and the people can utilize? I think this is really important to understand, that we're not saying that the justice that was called for in the BLM or the Antifa riots is the justice of the United States system. The justice of the United States system is built, and as my partner defined, enshrined in law. And this is important to remember. This comes with how the Constitution works and how we were given the law that gives us the ability to have justice. In the sense that, as my partner brought up, you are not able to be tried without knowing what you're being tried for. Every person is given the ability to have legal counsel, and if they can't provide it for themselves, then the state is actually required to provide it for them. Things that are important for justice. If you look at other countries, I know we were talking about comparing to other countries earlier. I think giving a comparison of other countries can actually give us an idea of how well we are doing. If you look at some of the other countries around us, there is not always that idea of this justice in their system. A lot of times people can disappear into the dark. I know in class recently we were talking about Egypt and their ability to interrogate certain persons of interest. And basically what happens is they would disappear off the face of the map. No one would ever see them again. They would be interrogated different ways that were not built into their system. They were not given justice in the way that they were tried, versus in the US, we have these abilities for justice. The second piece under the preamble that we're talking about is domestic tranquility. Domestic tranquility is also a difficult one coming off of this summer. We saw a lot of unrest over this summer, and I think a lot of us experienced it in our cities. We saw it in the news, a lot of issues, right? Let's take a step back and look at two prominent examples. I think the first one that comes to mind is actually Libya. If you think about Libya, Libya was an area where we tried to work and we tried to help them create something like this. Different areas of North Africa, we actually tried to work with this. As my partner brought up, you have a lot of wars, a lot of civil wars. If you go back to 2011, 2012, and the whole issue we were there, Benghazi and all of that, we see a lot of strife and a lot of uprising in those areas. Not really domestic tranquility. I would venture to say that most of us can go to sleep at night without worrying whether or not we're going to wake up in the morning. Something that you can't find in a lot of other countries all the time. Another prominent example is actually France. France is an interesting one because, as my partner brought up earlier, France had the revolution right on the heel of ours. And in a sense, our founding fathers were actually supportive of their revolution because this idea of coming against a tyrannical government and fighting against it for freedom and for liberty that we talked about was so important to us. What happened in France? France didn't turn out so well. As we talked about, they've gone through 5 governments since that point. The amount of people that they killed during the French Revolution and the years after that was insane. I don't know who all here has traveled in Europe for the 6 weeks that I was there in spring. We were actually warned about going to France currently because if you go to France, it's actually hard to get your train or your bus to come back because the amount of people that go on strike while you're there and the amount of strife that you have in France often allows for travel to be shut down. Just a small thing that we found out that's still actually going on over there. So I think that idea of comparison can actually show us, can kind of give us a lens to look at that domestic tranquility through. The next piece that we're looking at is the common defense. We brought up earlier the idea of the common defense through our military that I think is very important for us to remember, that our military is very well funded in order to protect us, our foreign borders, or our borders here in the US against foreign issues, things like that. The other idea is common defense within our country, and I think this is also important to remember how much money we put into our police systems, our EMTs, our first responders, firefighters, hospitals, things like that. Common defense is actually very central to who we are and what we do for every person in the US.
1 minute remaining.
The last, welfare actually kind of goes under this as well, the idea that we're constantly looking out for the people of the US in these ways. And then finally, liberty. Liberty is a very important one because liberty is the idea that we have the freedom to choose. The freedom to choose is very important, and I think that's what makes America what America is. We talked earlier about how the people have failed and certain people have gone wrong. This is true. This is because the American experiment has succeeded in giving people the ability to choose. The failings of the individual does not equal the failing of the nation. The nation allowed the people to choose. If they chose wrong, that's not the failing of the nation. That's not the failing of the American experiment. That is the failure of the individual. I'd like to leave you with a quote from Lexington Tocqueville, who was a political philosopher, French political philosopher, and he said, "The greatness of America lies not in her exceptional ability to be enlightened more than other countries, but rather in her exceptional ability to correct her faults." Thank you.
Do we have a question for Mr. Schutte? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so, I heard you reference comparing but what if instead of comparing the American system to the system of other countries, we first use just the standard of the original American system of the Constitution, and look at things that happened in recent years that are seeming to be a direct violation of that system, like Trump just...
Please conclude the question.
And,
Conclude the question, please.
so like abortion, that denies it. Set out in the Constitution. So I think those would be our views.
Also in the form of a question, please.
So what would you say to that?
If I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying that we should be comparing first and foremost. You're basically wondering if we should be comparing first and foremost to our Constitution versus other countries? I agree, and I think we've done both. I think, and this kind of got hazy, and this is something that needs to be clarified. I think you're right. We need to first take what we have, our Constitution, and the way that we have either kept to that or not kept to that. Yes, I think the countries and the way I reference them are supposed to be a greater ability to see how they're examples of how other countries have not. So it's not to say, compared to this country, we're doing great, but more of a way of saying, this is an example of where they went wrong. This is where we've actually held to our standards. It's kind of a comparison, but not in the sense that that's the only thing we're comparing to. I think first and foremost, we do have to see whether or not we've held to the Constitution.
Thank you, Mr. Schutte. We are about to move into open floor speeches where anybody may speak for up to 5 minutes with the opportunity to answer one question from the crowd like the presenters. I would like to encourage you to be rather loud with your stomping and your hearing and your snapping and your hissing. It's the only way some of us pay attention. So, and also, for as many lectures as we attend, this is the only time you're able to give direct feedback if you don't like what you're hearing. There you are. So, yes, we will now open the floor for open floor speeches. If you would like to be selected, please stand up and raise your hand. You, sir. Yes.
Thank you.
You may come into the middle of the room.
If the American experiment was that America would be without flaws or foibles, then I would agree with the House that it has failed. But I don't think that's what the experiment is. The experiment that is that if people dedicate themselves to the proposition that all men are created equal, then they will prosper. The American experiment doesn't fail when we fail, it fails when we don't endure. Take slavery, for example. I know we talked about a proponent of this proposition said that because we don't all agree on the common good, that means the American experiment has failed. But have we ever agreed on the common good? I don't think so. I think the North and the South would have disagreed about what the common good was. I think that's my cue to stop talking.
All right, yes, do we have a question for the gentleman?
Come on, there must have been a reason for all that, yes.
Mr. O'Hara.
Yeah, which side do you support?
Your side.
Well, we are happy to hear from anybody here. If it is something that could be said in 2 minutes or less, I would invite you to wait until the lightning round, so that way if anybody has anything longer, maybe more prepared, we can hear the 5-minute speeches then, and then move into the 2-minute speeches.
Also, if you're upstairs and want to give a speech, you should probably come down as well.
Yeah, that's fair. Yes, sir.
Alright, so I'm actually not really sure how long my speech is going to take, so I apologize in advance if it ends up being under 2 minutes. So let's, first of all, in order to decide the truth about this motion, whether the American experiment has failed, I think we can all agree that we need to define our terms. So there's 2 things that need to be defined. We need to figure out what the American experiment is, and we need to figure out what its measure of success is. And I think the opposing side has done a good job in trying to figure that out. About trying to figure out its measure, about what the American experiment is. Now, I would say that probably the American experiment, it seems like if they're quoting the preamble, it would consist in our system of government as established in the Constitution, and the measure of success would be whether or not it's actually established the things that they listed in the preamble. Now, that being said, I think that I don't really like the way they've established their point, and I think that right now, I think that the affirming side has a good chance to question whether or not they've actually established those, whether or not the American experiment has actually been successful on those 5 points. So for instance, we talk about like promoting the general welfare. I think that was what their main argument was, is that we have not promoted the general welfare. Now what we need to figure out now is whether or not we've been absolutely we obviously have not been absolutely flawless, but now we need to decide if the problem in promoting general welfare has been a few flukes like Roe v. Wade, or if it's something more systemic and ingrained in the Constitution. And then also, I think that there's room for questioning whether or not we really have done things like established justice or provided for the common defense. So I don't think that quoting our military spending is actually a good way to establish that we provided for the common defense. Because the founding fathers actually did not want us to have a standing army. I guess that's all I have to say for now. But I think that the most important part of this motion is agreeing on definitions of terms. And after that, establishing whether or not we've actually measured up to the measure of success.
Do we have a question for our speaker? Do we have anybody who's not Mr. McKenna?
Dr. Plato.
Yeah, Dr. Plato. Please.
Here. To be clear, are you saying that we should adopt their definition? We do adopt their definition. It has to be on the ground things that have to, and therefore we should affirm it.
I think that we should adopt their definition of success. I think that I might slightly modify their definition of the experiment just so that because I think I didn't really like Mr. McKenna's defining it as enshrined in liberty and law, because then you need to establish a thesis that the Constitution is actually successful in doing that. And I don't think that they have adequately established that we have actually measured up to success.
Thank you, sir. Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Steven. I hear so there's some disagreement on terms. So I'm going to say some words that we all understand and not use their words. So I hear that one side says the American dream is failing, or the American experiment, I'm sorry, is failing, and one side says the American experiment has failed.
Please, no comments from the presenters.
I think that this is a brilliant prompt because it invites it invites conversation, and we've established that there is a problem. Something is going wrong, and I think that I'm here to propose a solution. President Ronald Reagan once said, "Every major change in American history started at the dinner table." Okay? And I think that if we have more conversations like these in our homes, with our families, I think that we can begin to start to change the direction, because I would agree with what both sides seem to be saying is that we are headed in a bad direction. That there are many flaws in the current system. Okay? I would say that the American experiment has not failed, but it is being tested. And I think that it's up to us to make the decision for where we go next. I think I'm done.
Do we have a question for our representative? Oh, yes, if you can speak loudly.
What does this have to do with the proposition?
Because whether it's failed or not, we can move on from here. We can make things better.
All right, thank you. Mr. Denver.
I'll get right to it. So the opposing side has defined it as liberty enshrined in law. Their argument is completely ahistorical. There's some pie-in-the-sky ideal, and now I think we all have a sense that there's, okay, let's take an example, the Capitol storming. Notice that people had American flags while they were storming the centerpiece of our republic. What does that say about the faith of the people in a representative democracy? Another example. Provide for the common defense. I'm going to list a name of countries. The Philippines, Japan, Vietnam, Korea, Angola, South Sudan, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Kuwait, Oman. The list goes on. When did providing for the common defense become providing for the American interest? Why did we leave the British Empire? And yet, what have we become? We left the British Empire. So notice how there's this real tension between the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution, between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Because the founders knew someday we could become exactly what we tried to get away from, which is a global empire. And yet we've become that. You know, there was an enormous debate at World War I of whether or not we should participate. And also World War II, because the idea was, we're America. Why are we trying to go to foreign wars?
Why are we keeping up foreign wars? Well, is it for the common defense, or is it for growing a global American military financial empire? Now, post-World War II, we had a global threat. It was communism. It was the Soviets, right? But the Soviets figured out that their communistic ideals, their 5-year plans, their starving their people, was actually less productive than just assenting to the American dominance of military and participating in a global financial system within it. Yeah. Right? So no longer is it a society, no longer is it competing military. There's one dominant military, which is the United States. That's where we're the reserve dollar, we're the reserve currency. And we support a global $3 trillion a year global military to preserve favorable trade deals for the United States and for its allies. Was that the American experiment? Was the American experiment of the founders to create this global military financial empire? Not enshrined in law, whatever that means. So this is not like, oh, the American people are bad, oh, the American people have failed. It's we're storming the Capitol building with symbols of America, from America the Republic. We're no longer the Republic, we are the Empire. It's unfortunate, we've got ourselves into this mess. And then notice with the Scipio example, where he says like, we're no longer Rome. They still kept all the symbols of the Republic. So to the American people, they fly American flags and saying you're patriotic, but we no longer represent what we originally stood for. So I had a friend just ship off to Kuwait, and now he's going to be stationed there for a while. I have family in the military. I'm not putting anything against people in the military at all. What I'm saying is we're in a completely different experiment. The experiment that we try to get away from originally. So to conclude with it, the American people and the American government and the military empire are two distinct things. People are feeling this tension. No one's actually running for office to actually like dismantle this empire. All our elected officials are for that. And all the internal conflicts, I feel, are just diversions. Let's say racism, and I'm not saying it's not a real thing, but that racism is like the conflict that's going to bring down America.
Please conclude.
So I'll conclude with this. The experiment we have made is no longer the original American experiment. We've moved from the American Republic to the American Empire, and the American people need to realize and return to those core principles.
One question from Mr. Denton. Mr. Lapis.
You talk a lot about America, how we kind of evolved from a republic to an empire. Should we surrender all of our foreign assets that we've worked hard for? It seems like it'd be counterintuitive. Should we surrender all of our foreign assets at a time when China is pressing its global influence and threatening the ideals of freedom?
Should Saruman dismantle the Uruk-hai?
That was good.
Chesterton said, if Patrick Henry were to return to Earth, he might have ended his famous quotation to simply give me death, the alternative liberty being manifestly impossible. If you agree with that, then you agree with the House that what the founders wanted to achieve cannot easily or practically at all be had today. But I'm going to argue way past the point. I'm going to argue that it was a failure even to try the experiment. The Catholic Church has always defended freedom better than anyone else against the Manichees, the Lutherans, the Calvinists, the Chancellors, everybody. But the question is, what is freedom? Is American freedom the real thing? 2 points. First point, liberty in law, freedom of speech as Americans understand it. What is it? Definition, the right to express any opinions without government restraint, provided you're not causing harm to anyone. Is that fair? Fair. Well, for the men well, it's everybody's question. Do you think women should be treated with respect? So, men, let's say someone is making crude remarks about your sister. Do you let him and then argue against him later and beat him in the marketplace of ideas? No, he's all tall. He's all tall. He's not going to harm you know that. That's not what you do. You say, shut up, I'm not going to let you say that in my presence. You might say, you can stop them, but should the government stop them? Well, what is the government? I thought it was the government of the people. I thought we were the government. I stood here and defended to you the proposition that pedophilia is a good thing. We need more of it. You would shout me down, and hopefully I would get expelled. The government does not shut down the North American Man-Boy Love Association, that's real, because they're not doing anything, they're just talking. But they're evil, and that should be enough. If you love the truth, you have to hate its opposite, not merely disagree with it. The man who does not shut down someone mentioning after his sister does not love her. And yet there's not one proposition in America, no matter that we all agree with it, that we would punish a man for denying or opposing. It is a mistake to set up a society that way. Second point, where does this go? Where do we end up? Well, if we're not after truth, and apparently we're not, given that, what are we after? We're after freedom. We set up a society where the most important thing we act like we really need the most, is freedom, understood as the ability to say and do whatever. That's what we have. And a society founded on the proposition that we can try to say anything, whatever. Well, let me back up. We may think certain things are good. We may like certain propositions, believing something. We may like doing certain things. But those are optional. There's a problem. Neutrality is non-existent. If something is optional, then it's unnecessary. If it's unnecessary, then it doesn't matter. That's what we have. A society built on the proposition that we can do and say anything, whatever, without caring about the truth, acting so truth doesn't matter. If we all agreed on the truth tomorrow, we still wouldn't try it in the law, because that would shut down people's freedom. And the purpose of government, we all agree, is protecting freedom. So it's worse. It's worse than what I said. The problem is that we think truth cannot be allowed to matter, or you will destroy freedom. So even the truth we do know we have to ignore. Marriage vows inhibit freedom, so we must have no fault divorce. My body inhibits numerous things, so we must have sex reassignment surgery. We must have in vitro fertilization. We must have rent a womb so I can be a woman, do what a woman does. That's where it ends. Sacrificing truth to freedom. I'm not saying we shouldn't love America. It's our home. We should love the place, love the people, love the history. But we cannot accept the ideology. It's a matter of loving the sinner, but hating the sin. The system, predicated on the fact that truth is not important, has to go. I'll say one more thing. The founders would hate this. They hate what we have become. They wouldn't agree with it. Like 15 seconds. Martin Luther would have hated non-denominationalism and liberal Protestantism. That doesn't mean that he didn't cause them. The nature of an experiment is that it has unexpected results. They didn't get the results they wanted. Question?
Yes, one question for the gentleman in the... Yes, ma'am.
I have a small question. So you mentioned that if we live in a society where it's optional, that it's unnecessary, when it's unnecessary, that it doesn't matter. Can you just give a couple, examples where that could flush that point out? Because if something is optional, then that means you can do it. So then, does that mean that just like the relativism of our society means that just because you can do it means that you should, even if it's optional, but that is also unnecessary? You know, could you like flush that point out a little bit?
So you want an example?
Sure.
Well, faithfulness in marriage would be a good example. You can do it, but there's no punishment involved if you don't. And in fact, no one is even suggesting that there might be. You might not use contraception, but, I mean, you should have the choice. That's what we say. So if the truth is something which you can follow or not follow, if goodness is a thing you can be into or not be into, then it is irrelevant to life as such.
Here, here.
It's not a matter of prescribing people's lives for them, but there's such a thing as human nature, and it can't be optional.
Thank you, sir. We are going to look for preferably an opposing speech that helps up a argument opposing the motion. Once again, preferably not somebody Mr. McKenna. Yes, sir.
Thank you all. We got some nice, good jokes and laughs. I enjoy it, so not to criticize that. But let's start with one thing that is order. Order in the state and order in the soul, that is the person. Is there order in the person right now? We have different people, correct? We have certain people that are immoral and certain people that are moral. But if you don't have order within the person, you're not going to have order within the state. However, there are parts in America, this will tie into with my other point, is failure. Is the country, has it completely failed, or is it certain parts failing or struggling to succeed? That is, certain parts have order and certain parts don't have order. And it is the need to find reform and strength in that area. I don't mean the idea that get rid of the type of government we have and completely throw it away, but keep the ideals we have and try to get America to succeed. We need the order in order to help us make America not fail. I haven't said it has failed, I'm just saying that it's struggling. And we can still do more to help it out. And then, on my other point, we had talked about the military as well, and freedom. With the military, it is good in certain senses to get involved in foreign wars. I think we would all agree that fighting Nazi Germany during World War II was really acceptable. But certain wars that are controversy, such as the ones in the Middle East, may have had good intentions, or may have just been out of the need to get more oil and more money, or make the elite more prosperous. That's debatable. Okay? Now the next point is that we don't want to get into the empire side of America. It is good to get into foreign wars, but we should also know when to stop getting involved and let them figure it out on their own. And the third point is that when we have freedom, we say freedom is the ability to choose. But Thomas Aquinas says freedom is the ability to choose the good. So, tying it all up is America has the ability to still succeed, but we need the ability to choose the good and not to just choose anything at all. And that goes with the law and making it able to choose the good and not to be able to choose the bad completely. I'm not saying make every sin law that's punishable, but we should make it so it is, such as getting rid of pornography. We shouldn't have that made accessible by our citizens. We should make it choose the good, choose for pro-life, and not be attacked on our values.
Are there any questions for our speaker? Mr. Johnson.
So what was your definition of failure? When does it end?
When does it fail? I would say when it gets to the point of absolute failure, such as the French Revolution, not necessarily guillotining everyone's heads off, but I would say when the government no longer has the ability to do anything, and no longer support the people, and when the people are in themselves in a state of disarray. America has had different instances where we've struggled to maintain order, but we've always gotten back on our feet and restored order within the people. It gets difficult, but we can do it still, and there's still the hope to do it. I don't want to sound like a complete optimist, because I'm not, but I also want to but I also want to believe that there is hope, we can still do this, and we are still in the fight for order.
I would just like to speak for the House and say that we do believe that the heading is generally a failure. If there are any women in the House that would currently like to speak, we would particularly like to hear a speech from a woman, if there are any. Well, all right.
So, the opposing side held justice as the foundation for their American experiment. And the thing is, justice is a correct ordering. That's how Socrates defined it in the Republic. So if you look at America, we can see that there is subject to a disordering. Just look around you. I mean, COVID. So COVID is both a philosophical and a historical horror. So it's a philosophical horror because it eliminates reason. You think about it, this is a disease that kills people on hospice, and we have to wear soggy rags over our skin. This is a historical horror. So if you think about the horrors that have plagued our country, one that mainly comes to mind is the Donner Party. And this is where they use death in order to try to avoid death. That is cannibalism. And then you have Herodotus. And the most savage revenge that he comes up with is the slaughter of one's infants. And then you have Eusebius. And he recounts the misfortunes of the Jews. And this pinnacles with this mother who takes her own child and says, "As I have fed you, now you will feed me." She proceeds to cook and eat the child. And this horror was so great that the barbarians left in disgust. So then, with COVID, this surpasses all of them. Because, yes, it surpasses all of these horrors. Because we have death, and we're trying to normalize the use of death in order to prevent death. And we're using this as a basis of good. And then also the extremes are absent. We're not starving in this mountain range trying to get to California, so we have to resort to cannibalism. So because of this, there is a lack, this disordering in America means there's a lack of justice, and therefore, since justice has failed, so has the American experiment. Thank you.
Do we have a question for our speaker? Yes. Again, as long as you can speak loudly.
Yeah, sure. So cannibalism is a means of using death in order to try to avoid death. Thank you.
All right. For our next speech. Yes, sir.
Hear, hear! Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, I wish you peace and blessings and a very fruitful Lent to you all. So first, I want to discuss, my argument is going to go more into the historical side of whether or not this, whatever you call the American experiment, has failed. I've heard a lot about the preamble, about the Constitution, and I would like to open up by saying the first thing I would do if the Constitution was right in front of me is I would set it aflame and watch it burn so that we can get over the idea that it has any bearing or weight upon our current civilization. Do we have freedom of speech? This past year has shown that not even the President of the United States the freedom of the press. Sure, as long as you believe a certain idea that NBC and MSNBC and even to a certain extent Fox News. Yeah, screw those guys. I don't want them on air anymore. Any of them. Do we have freedom of religion? Sure, as long as you keep it in your own home, you bigot. Keep those crosses out of our school. And let's remember, a civilization needs a unifying ethic to even exist. What is America's unifying ethic? Is it the Constitution? If I burned it right now, nothing would change. We would continue on this downward trajectory, partially because the things like technology have accelerated infrastructural collapse, but that's a whole other argument. The Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race, by the way. More so, the important thing is, when discussing me burning the Constitution, is that our ruling oligarchs have shown that they do not care what is in the Constitution. They only seek to use the Constitution to establish their own hegemony, their supremacy, their control of the American people. We had an election. I didn't really care about the election. I live in Virginia. It's a solid blue state. I specifically live in Northern Virginia. I've had the same congressman since I was in elementary school. For the last 4 elections, he's run unopposed. Yes, he is a Democrat. I did not care about that election because anything I did not matter. Regardless of whether or not I live in a swing state, regardless of whether or not President Trump won and then was put into office, the trajectory of our civilization would continue on its downward path for a few reasons. The first is that all human machinations must at some point fail because they are not the majesty of the church. We all know that. Secondly, because, again, there is no unifying ethic. There's nothing that binds me and my next door neighbor together. Back home, my next door neighbor is a family of Pakistani Muslims. What similarities do I have with them than the fact that we are both American citizens and live on the same street? Absolutely nothing. We might shop in the same grocery store, but they shop in different aisles because their culture is different. We might, like I said, I went to school with one of their children. We might have gone to the same school, but did we run in the same circles? No. She was part of the Muslim Student Association. There wasn't a Catholic Student Association because I wasn't allowed. So the point I want to make with that is, when I think of the American experiment, we wanted this melting pot. And I'm not talking about the founding. That founding collapsed long ago. America's already been through 2 collapses. The first one was the Civil War. The second one was the Great Depression. Both of those were primarily infrastructural, but also had some philosophical. 1 minute. Thank you, sir. Had some philosophical ramifications. Now, what is this collapse going to look like? Ethnic conflict. Do we have that? Do we have ethnic conflict? Yeah. Do we have cultural depravity? Yeah. And do we have just a hopeless political class of political corruption? Yes. If you don't think that, you're stupid. I'm sorry. If you don't think they're insiders getting money from pharmaceutical companies, from agricultural companies, from all these different lobbying and interest groups to enact policy that is no longer representative of their constituency, you have no idea what is going on in America right now. The question is that, and this is my conclusion, the question is that this House believes that the American experiment has failed. Yes, it failed in the 90s. We are living through the collapse. Welcome, take a question. I want to hear from you.
We are going to take a question.
I know you.
Yes, please. Yes, ma'am. Up there.
Okay. My question is, do you really think that if we burned the Constitution, it would make no difference? Because in my opinion, having the Constitution makes it so that there's
Please just in the form of a question.
There's protection in the Constitution, for example, the Second Amendment. That gives the American people
Questions are not the time for an argument. You may speak later, but just a question.
to protect their right to own firearms. Do you really think that if the Constitution was burned tomorrow, that people would still have just as much power to protect their right to bear arms?
Yes, I would say that I would more so because they would feel a sense, and I'm going to go on for 1 minute, I apologize. Yes. So, in a previous Veritas debate, I argued in favor of gun control. Not because I want to take guns away, but my argument established that if a time came when guns need to be used to overthrow a tyrannical government, the American populace would do nothing because it is so atomized and so individualized and so de-unified that if 12 ATF agents came to the door, it wouldn't be 1776 again, it would be Soviet Russia. Either you hand over your gun or you go to the gulag. In terms of if the Constitution was burned, if I burned it right now, it would almost be, and bear with me for a moment, and I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Please conclude.
It would almost be better because those people that are Second Amendment enthusiasts and gun owners would feel more empowered to actually use their power against a tyrannical government than pretend like they have any protection from a useless piece of paper. Thank you.
All right, we're now going to speech.
Just
wow. Mr. Willie.
Well, you know, 2020 was a rough year. I think first we should be focusing, I think I should open my speech by saying we should focus not on what divides us, but on what unites us. And I do think something that is united both the House and those opposing the House is hatred of the French. Can we just... Frankly, pretty terrible. I'd like to start by quoting Pope John Paul II, Saint Pope John Paul II, who was actually in America in 1995. And he said, witnessing to Christ, which is what we're trying to do, right? Witnessing to Christ means drawing out of a culture the full meaning of its noblest intentions. That's a good thought to start with, isn't it? I think what we've heard this evening, we've actually heard some pretty good arguments, and we've heard some, I think we've established a pretty good premise of what the American experiment is. I don't have all the preamble memorized, but that's basically, we've established, the Constitution, that's basically what the American experiment is, in its historical context, as we just heard. But I think what we've heard tonight, to be honest, if I may say, we've heard a lot of rabble-rousing, which has emphasized the fact that the West is kind of in a tough place right now. And a lot of the arguments have just circled around this contention that we're in a bad spot. As really, it's talk about America, but as a civilization, right? The West is undergoing a certain crisis of identity, the likes of which I think we haven't seen probably since the Reformation, when Christendom split fundamentally, and sometimes it almost seems irrevocably apart. And so, sure, America is in a tough place right now, and what we've seen is a real fall away from the good, the true, the beautiful, from the sanctity of life, the sanctity of marriage in America, as we've seen it in Europe, as we've seen it, across the world. But I think one thing that has to be first addressed is that we really haven't had a proper explanation of what failed means. Because you can't just get up and say, we're in a tough place right now, and therefore the experiment's failed. Because to be honest, if you did that, what's to stop a Protestant from getting up and saying, the Catholic Church splintered at the Reformation, so the Catholic Church failed? You know, so I think you've got to establish what exactly do you mean by failed. And I actually think, the gentleman remind me of the name? Arab. Anyway, yeah, the honourable gentleman who gave such a great, if perhaps an impassioned speech, that is a fault of many Americans, and so I won't fault do I attribute this to him, yeah, maybe burning the Constitution. You know, I think Mr. Denley, again, gave an excellent speech about the American Empire and compared it to Sauron on the Uruk-hai. And, you know, I think that's just rather deceptive, because frankly, what is the failure? What is the definitive point, Mr. Johnson's description? What is the definitive failure of the experiment? Maybe a regime change, maybe the burning of the Constitution. And to say that America has experienced a regime change is incorrect. And actually what's important to recognize, and I do think, because we are pursuing truth in this debate, and so I'm not going to say wholeheartedly everything has been completely right by this side. I think one thing they haven't pointed out, the opposition, is that the Constitution isn't a static document, it's constantly being interpreted, right? And that interpretation is constantly being applied. And we have had some pretty cruddy interpretations, haven't we? Okay then, but quite frankly, we've had the issue of abortion brought up, and of course that's something that really unites us, and actually really pains us, right? As a faith community, and just as human beings. But then, if we're pro-life and we're going out and protesting abortion and going on the March for Life, because we're trying to change the law within the framework of the Constitution, within, dare I say, the American experiment. I think it just bespeaks a certain, I'm sorry, just like a whining attitude to me, just to get up and complain. All right, if you're going to complain, move to a different country. I don't know, I moved to America. And I think, even if there are a lot of problems, I shouldn't attribute bad attention to my opposition. Maybe you're not whining. I think you're raising legitimate complaints. But the point is, we're actually working within the framework of the experiment. And so in a certain sense,
Thank you for your speech, Mr. Willis.
I'm open for questions.
All right, one question for Mr. Willie, with the consideration that he is a Brit and not to be trusted. Dr. Blair.
You just said that we need to define failure, right? And you said that we haven't failed if it's not failed, we can, lobby for loss, but if we do that forever, but the injustices stay, are you still going to say we haven't failed? Ooh, hear, hear.
So I would say the experiment hasn't failed, because I think the hidden premise of your question is that there's a society that eliminates injustice. I don't think that's true. I think you live within a society of injustice. I think it seems that if your regime hasn't changed, then the experiment is ongoing. Now, something as egregious as abortion, I suppose I'm not sure a society can sustain itself and its regime with something like that. So maybe you're saying, what, in 250 years, if abortion is still around, has the experiment failed then? Well, I don't think society will be around in 250 years if we keep abortion. So, I think, yes, I would say injustice will always be there. Thank you.
All right, we are going to get 2 more open floor speeches, and then we're going to hear from Mr. McNamara to conclude the open floor session. Mr. Stremke, our sitting.
They're here!
So I find this conversation interesting because it seems very ungrateful to me. We're sitting here in the most peaceful time, in the most wealthy time, in a nation that is ostensibly Christian by world standards. I mean, go to Europe and show me some real Christians there. And we're complaining. Don't get me wrong, there's plenty that's wrong with this country. But talking about Plato's Republic, talking about the form of a nation, and acting as if not living up to that standard means America has failed, that seems ridiculous to me. You know, I think we really have to take a historical perspective when we look at these things. And you have to ask yourselves, what constitutes the failure of a nation? Did America fail when the Senate was bombed back in the 70s? Did America fail when George Washington had to go out and put down insurrections? Did America fail when the Christian life was revitalized, 2 separate times in this country? I don't think we did. I think that, as cliche as it sounds, as long as the ideals that America was founded on are still valued, we haven't failed. You can fight for those ideals, and you can continue to choose to advance them, right? And as long as you do that, America hasn't failed. Now, if we vote that America has failed, if we vote that there's nothing worth continuing, that history that we stand on isn't worth a damn, well, I mean, you're welcome to try something new. If you're on the left, I would say Chaz failed fairly quickly. If you're on the right, I mean, the Amish are doing pretty well, but that's than I would care for. So, I guess what I would stress and what I would encourage everyone here to do is understand that this country has circled the drain before, that we faced very serious issues in our history. We didn't fail in the 90s, as some people have talked about. We didn't fail during the Great Depression. And we haven't failed now. As long as you choose to keep on fighting for this nation, to keep on fighting for what is right, I'd say that we're still in a pretty good spot.
All right, any questions for Mr. Shumke? Yes, you, sir, with the hat.
Well, when you say we haven't failed, what do you, it comes down to the question, what do we mean when we have failed in this country? What do we mean when we will fail? What is the,
I think there's different ways that a nation can fail. I think that the primary way that a nation fails is when the people give up on its founding principles. So, on the day when life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are no longer valued, when we decide that we're going to attempt to pursue something new, a different course, I think on that day, America has truly failed.
Hear, hear.
All right, one more open floor speech. Mr. Harold.
Hear, hear.
So I realize for obvious reasons that there might be some sense in me limiting my contributions tonight. But I got inspired by my colleague, Mr. Willie, and I hope the House will appreciate that I did at least make some effort to dress in red, white, and blue. Getting to the issue at hand, I do think we've heard a lot of anti-American sentiment tonight. And I would echo the previous 2 speakers in condemning that. I've been blessed over the years to be able to visit a number of different countries and several different continents, and I'm not sure I've ever encountered a country quite like the United States of America. I'm not sure I've ever encountered a country with such high ideals, such noble aspirations, and such a vibrant, if at times overbearing sense of patriotism. At the same time, however, I think the vast majority of people in this room, when they say, as they are apt to, that America is the greatest country on earth. I'm not sure that they mean that we are necessarily in the best place right now. It seems to me when you say America is the greatest country on earth, what you're saying is that it has these noble ideals, it has this noble foundation, which about half of the population tries to live up to. But it seems to me that we also have to recognize that the American ideal, the American aspiration, is distinct from the American experiment. And it's when we look at the American experiment, which the opposing side have themselves defined in political terms, that I think we do see a certain failure. Again, the American ideal, America in its aspiration, is certainly great. And we need to remember that and applaud that and fight for that. But the whole reason we need to fight for that is because we know that something has gone seriously wrong. And so I know with these Veritas debates, there's often a certain frustration with definitions, and it all just comes down to that. But I think the reality is that every debate comes down to definitions in the end. And so I think it's important that we try to work through the definitions provided and see if we can draw closer to truth. So the definition that the opposing side provided this evening was this idea of the American experiment being a democratic republic with liberties enshrined into law. And I think that's great, but it clearly doesn't go far enough. It's clearly not specific enough. Apart from anything else, there's a reason it's the United States of America. Again, the opposing side were very eloquently quoting the preamble to the Constitution. But why would we stop at the preamble? Let's take a look at the whole Constitution. The Constitution, which I see as effectively summing up the American experiment, and I agree with them there, I just think we should look at the whole Constitution. That same Constitution is, as we know, the compromise reached by the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And one of the key elements in that political framework is the Federalist Principle. The idea that states would maintain their individual rights, their individual identity, without ceding too much ground to the federal government. So if I'm right, if this is the American experiment, and I'm using their own terms and their own definition, simply extending it logically, if I'm right about that, then the question really becomes, do we think that that federal system is still amenable today, or is it a system that's failed? And there I would simply point to the role of the Supreme Court in recent decades. In Roe versus Wade, the federal Supreme Court told states they're no longer able to protect their unborn children. Mississippi is not allowed to protect its unborn children. That is a failed experiment. In the Veritas versus Hodges, states were told they can no longer uphold the institution of marriage. That is a failed experiment. Just last year, the Supreme Court laid the groundwork such that states won't be able to define something as fundamental as gender. So ladies and gentlemen, tonight I would ask you simply to ask yourself, what is America? It is the United States of America, and by virtue of the Supreme Court, the federal Supreme Court, denying that principle, I think by definition the experiment has failed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harold. So just to make sure that I have it clear, you believe that the American experiment has failed because of the decision in Roe versus Wade and similar Supreme Court decisions that usurp the rights of the states against the federal government?
Yeah, thank you for the question. My position is that the American experiment, as you guys have defined it, that definition is inadequate. Because you're forgetting a key element in what makes America what it is, which is federalism. And it seems to me that given that not just in Roe, but in a number of Supreme Court cases, we come to the point where the Federalist Principle is undermined, then the experiment has failed.
Thank you, Mr. Harold. Now for our final open floor speech, we are going to ask Mr. McGrath to come up and speak. After which we will proceed into the lightning round, you'll be able to give 2-minute speeches.
Okay, a couple of responses. First of all, I was a little disheartened that there was not as much focus on our seminal founding document, the Declaration of Independence. It provides the principles upon which the Constitution was elaborated. With regard to foreign wars, many people thought that Afghanistan was a backwater. That wasn't until 9/11. With regard to the pandemic of fear and the importance of a check on executive power, we come to conclude that it really does matter which state you live in and who's the governor of that state. With respect to abortion, if you look at the wonderful thing in the United States, it's very difficult, but there is an active political debate regarding this matter, as evidenced including by the most recent election. With regard to Mr. Harrow, I would identify myself as an anti-federalist, and those were towards a more perfect union, not a perfect union. Nobody's professing that that's the case. With regard to the influence of the United States abroad, I have visited 39 countries. My focus was on Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, and those countries that had their independence restored. So I stood on the beachhead at Normandy at the American cemetery, where 5,000 of our Americans are laid to rest for their defense of overcoming the Nazis in the Second World War. I've been to Berlin, to the Brandenburg Gate, where for over 25 years, a wall separated the German people, east and west, until Ronald Reagan in 1987 had the temerity, against the advice of the State Department, to stand and to call on Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down that wall, which eventually happened. None of us imagined it could have happened. He had the guts to call for it. I stood in 2004 on the Maidan, the principal main square in Kiev, which is the capital of Ukraine, with hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who came out to stand in protest against falsified elections. I tell you, Americans may not have much of an appreciation for the principles enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, but I've met many individuals across the world who look to that document, to those principles, as an inspiration to shake off authoritarian governments that they unfortunately live under. The founders, the unique aspect of America was that it was founded upon ideas. It was not founded upon hereditary leadership or blood. A wonderful thing about America is when you become an American citizen, it doesn't matter where you came from, but you are an American, plain and simple. Try that in Japan. Try that in most of the other countries of the world. The founders emphasized that the only way this experiment was going to succeed was on a virtuous citizenry. That is the crux of the problem we face today. Washington observed that virtue and morality is a necessary spring for popular government, and he was right. And I would challenge each of us, because what we can wind up doing is saying, well, that was a nice discussion. What can I do? You can do something. You can live a virtuous life.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
Speak the truth in the public square, and you can live out the faith that you profess.
Thank you. I'll try to do it.
The Constitution is not a perfect document. It has survived for 233 years. The founders wanted to disperse the powers, political powers, and it can be frustrating, but it is better than having people hold up their fingers to the political winds of popular opinion today. Imagine what would happen if our founding were to take place today. What ideals would be enshrined in a founding document? a major problem that we do have is progressivism, because they, as a generalization, do not believe in truth. So there have been some references to God, and when you take God out of the equation, then much evil does arise. I surely will. G.K. Chesterton once observed, whenever the people do not believe in something beyond the world, they will worship the world. And not only that, but they'll worship the strongest thing, which often is the state.
Hear, hear.
In his book, Render Unto Caesar, Archbishop Charles Chapuis challenged American Catholics. You say that you are Catholic, what difference does that make? Thank you.
Hear, hear. Take one question, please. I'll take one question. Does anybody have a question for Mr. McMahon? Yeah, Dr.
If the preservation of liberty of all individuals is a virtue and based on a Christian principle, will the United States thereby never fail the experiment and always be rooted in a Christian framework?
Okay. The founders, depending on, I haven't delved into what their own personal beliefs were, but they saw religion as a vehicle for the promotion of virtue. Would it be right from the beginning, Thomas Jefferson insisted in the Declaration of Independence that there be envisioned that the government that they were hoping to set up would not prove efficacious. So he actually, so if you look at the text of the Declaration itself, it does envision the possibility of a new form of government, which they in fact did institute under the Constitution that we live under today, as opposed to the Articles of Confederation. Yes, there is a major problem regarding belief in God. That's for sure.
All right, thank you. We are now going to move into the lightning round. You have 2-minute speeches. There will be no questions. If you would like to address something said in the past, then you will have to give your own speech. Mrs. McCuff. Mrs. McCuff.
Here, here.
As a political science student, I thought I'm obliged to say something. So I want to mention the Declaration of Independence, as Mr. McNamara said. In writing the Declaration, our founding fathers wrote of the grievances that they had against the British Parliament and the British King. And they had a whole list of grievances, but the main idea was the British King and the British Parliament are being tyrannical. So the purpose... So because that government was tyrannical, the American people believed that they could abolish this government, set up a new one, because power ultimately derives from the people. So if the American founding is based on opposition to tyranny, a new government that tries not to be tyrannical, then the central question today that we should ask ourselves is whether there is tyranny present in the American nation. I would argue that, in a sense, we have the tyranny of the liberal elites. However, we don't necessarily yet have the tyranny of the majority, and there's still room for discussion. We might look to discussion about COVID today. In America, there is a far wider discussion about COVID. If you look to nations in Europe, I know about Poland, there is not a discussion on the same level. There are still means to oppose this tyranny. So if we don't completely succumb to that tyranny of the liberal minority, I would say that the American experiment is still ongoing. Thank you.
Mr. Feigelman, if you would please, on the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe that one thing we can all agree on, perhaps, at least back in the day, a couple hundred years ago, is one thing we hate, and that would be the British. But I have a couple of really quick points that I want to make in terms of contradictions. One would be the fact that the definition of success that the opposing side has put forward tonight would be liberty enshrined in law, as if this is the highest principle and this is the measure by which we determine whether or not the American experiment has succeeded or failed. Now, I just looked up a ton of quotes from all of the Founding Fathers, and almost every single one says something to the effect that neither the wisest laws nor the wisest constitution will secure true freedom or true happiness for a people that is not virtuous. Thomas Jefferson says it. George Washington says it. Samuel Adams, that was a quote directly from Samuel Adams. John Adams says it. They all say it. So this is one point that they need to address if they're going to oppose this motion successfully. The second thing is a couple of those points in the preamble to the Constitution that you guys made. One was the promotion of the common good, and the second one was liberty. Let's just think about those two things for a second. Those two things don't really fit together, especially as Mr. Should defined liberty, which was the freedom to choose. Choose what? Anything? He didn't give a sufficient understanding or development of the concept of liberty, and so therefore, how can you have a common good when every individual has the freedom to do whatever they want? How is that common? That's
All right, another speech, please. The gentleman in the suspenders.
I think it was Mr. Williams said, if you don't like it here, you should move to another country. And I would agree with him and say, Poland, baby! Poland for the win! Anyway, I have an actual speech. I'm a humanities and Catholic culture major, so I have to talk about culture or else I will keel over and die. I think that can distinguish a lot of what's been said thus far about government and the executive power thereof, but we also have to talk about culture. And so we have to distinguish between material failure and moral failure. The government is still materially standing, the infrastructure is intact, the laws still have power. However, the culture has failed morally on a spectacular level. It seems to me that when the culture fails morally on the level that it has in this country, then the infrastructure is soon to follow. Almost inevitably, it would seem. And this has occurred on a physical, mental, and spiritual level. Physical, material reality is malleable, which usually ends up becoming mutilation, especially as regards human nature, the human body. Abortion is not only legal, but even glorified in modern culture. 1 minute? Cool. Mental, intellectual, propaganda, shoved down the throats. They were like, yeah, we have this cool new thing called science, scientific methods. Let's get rid of like history, philosophy, theology, and just like put science up on the shiny pedestal. In fact, you know, history, you're a science. Ethics, you're a science now. Philosophy, you're a science now. Science is dope. Historical Darwinism, all of that. Spiritual, yeah, intolerance in the name of toleration. Yeah, like Mr. Araps, the Honorable Mr. Araps said. Keep it in your house, you bigot. It's not very cash money, not gonna lie. Not pretty cringe and blue, that's it.
The gentleman in the red tie.
Here, here.
So I came in tonight somewhat undecided, but became pretty convinced pretty fast that I should favor the motion. However, as it's gone on, I'm starting to believe that I actually oppose it. Now here's the reason. We talk about how society has kind of failed morally. Well, Benjamin Franklin said that liberty will persist as long as the people want it. Now, I feel like, the side has provided a definition of liberty, but I don't think that that's kind of generally agreed upon by the general people. right? A lot of people, they want freedom, and they imagine that freedom and liberty are interchangeable. And as long as they want freedom, they'll do whatever it takes to get there. And at first, that's one big problem I have, right? Like, what is America if it's just everyone going around trying to get the most freedom? Like, they can say whatever they want to get that freedom, they can do whatever they want to get that freedom. And that doesn't seem right, and I think a lot of people would agree with that, right? And the whole idea where anyone can say anything, the marketplace of ideas, feels really wrong. I mean, Luke Orsay said that in most society, if you say something dumb enough to someone, they'll punch you in the face. And in America, that's not really the way that we imagine things. But I think that might be a good thing, actually. Benjamin Franklin saying that liberty will persist as long as we want it. But liberty will persist as long as we want it. That will persist, that will mean essentially that as long as we want it, it'll be there. Like the storming of the Capitol. You don't storm a Capitol of a democracy that you feel represents you adequately. And as long as we actually act upon our insecurities and concerns with our democracy, I don't feel like it will fail. Like we're gonna go through these rough patches where we're kind of trying to figure out what are we as a culture, what are we as America? But as long as we want that liberty, as long as we work toward it, and as long as we work toward it morally to understand what that liberty actually is, I don't feel like America can fail. It'll only fail when we become apathetic and feel that liberty is unachievable. Thank you.
For our illustrious founder, Mr. McGill.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I would like to just propose a different definition of failure. And I think it's interesting that being a very, very Catholic institution, we haven't brought this point up, and I'd like to bring it up now. In God we trust. What does that mean? And how does that relate to our proposition tonight? I think that in Christian moral principles, we discuss how we want to mold our life and our morals off of Christ. And I think we should try to do that with, it's a fine line we're walking, but try doing that with our government. Let's look at how the Catholic Church is run, right? You know, it's definitely inspired by God, but we are still in face value, is run by humanity. And you look at, you know, the Great Schism, comparatively to the Civil War in our history in the United States, or the sex scandals, and you can look at all the problems we're having with, you know, for example, with Trump and his insult on women. I mean, when we look at the failure, I mean, do we define that the church, the Catholic Church, is failing based on few points in history? I mean, I leave that up to you. What do you think? I personally don't think the Catholic Church has failed. And that point, and that point only, I believe that the American experiment has not failed either. Thank you very much.
Mr. Murphy.
The last time I did this, I shouted at people, so I'm going to be very cautious. Do you still have the ability to hear? Yes. Excellent. I'm going to start with something that my dad said. Now, granted, this is edited, and he was saying it over a beer. Other countries hate us because, the opposite. Other countries hate us because Americans are cool as heck. You can see where the edit comes in. I got the laugh when I wanted. Feeding my ego here, thank you. Something that someone brought up earlier was that change starts at a dinner table. Well, let's make sure that's not where it stops. It goes up here. My brothers in the military, about is the fact that a lot of people will just slap bumper stickers on their car saying, support our vets, or, stuff like that, post things on Facebook. But that never converts itself to action. You don't see those same people volunteering at clinics that help, vets with PTSD. You don't see those people donating money to help veterans. We don't act on this stuff, we just complain about it on Facebook and in private conversations with our siblings. So let's stop complaining about the elites, let's focus on our individual communities and helping the people around us that we see every single day. In Milwaukee, a dozen veterans, my mom works for the VA, committed suicide within December alone. That is disgraceful. And there's something that we can do about it. So let's get off our butts. As you can see, I'm standing now. I'm doing something. Let's put words into action.
Alright, we're going to move into our final lightning round speech, and then we will hear concluding statements from our presenters. Mr. Larkin, please.
Do a backflip! I take responsibility seriously. And I suppose I noticed that everyone who's gotten up to speak before me has pants that are totally intact. And so the generation of people that built America is not being fully represented. So I go. And what I'll say is this, one point that we can make, because I only have a few minutes allotted to me, and many points have been made prior by people who are far more eloquent and capable than myself as well. So I circumscribe myself to this only, which is that principled arguments in favor of America, or really any sort of ideology of some kind, are absolutely meaningless without transcendentals. Transcendentals are eternal and immutable, and therefore while I agree with the principles that are outlined in things like the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, or that we call the statements of our founding fathers excellent, but they are absolutely meaningless, which is that we have absolutely castrated ourselves from any fruition that they might have if we get rid of the transcendentals to which they relate. So my point is simply this. I think we can affirm the greatness of the principles of America and say at the same time that America has demonstrably failed because we've cut ourselves off from the generating principle which gave them life to begin with. So that seems like a good point to make a farming analogy, but of course I don't farm, so despite my appeal to emotion earlier. I'll conclude it perhaps on this one point then. If you are unable to say that America is fundamentally a religious and a Catholic people, because Catholic is in fact that which is true and relates to universals and things that are objectively real in ways that we do not define. If you are incapable of saying that, then you have to admit that all of the foundations upon which you are appealing that America has been great are no more than dust and ashes, and they will soon return to them without the
Thank you, Mr. Larkin. All right, we will now hear from, once again, the affirming side with their final speech.
Thank you. And thank you everybody who came up and spoke. This has been very inspiring. I'd like to clarify the affirming side. We don't hate America. We do not hate America. We're not anti-American at all. I think the first step to change is realizing our reality. What we're living in, what we're facing, what we're up against, right? If we can't face that reality and look around with clear vision, no change can happen. None. So what we're not saying that we hate America. In fact, we've been comparing America to a lot of countries throughout the night, right? We've been saying, okay, well, America's a lot better than this country, so it hasn't failed, right? I think that's faulty thinking. Because you can keep comparing America to this, oh, it's better than that, it's better than that. That gives you no metric to whether it's actually failed. I say we compare America to what America says that we stand for. I say we compare America to the principles that we said that we support. So if we have no justice, thank you. If our justice is flawed, have we failed? America has dissented from morality, and that's why I believe it's failed. We've dissented from truth, and that's why I believe it's failed. And the evil has choked the good so far that America has failed. How are we supposed to stand up for our Christian faith when we're persecuted?
I'm not saying that other countries aren't persecuted, but the evil in America is choking the good. And those principles that America was founded on are not being upheld. So we can go on and on about the Constitution and how good it was. But if that's not actualized, and I believe it has not, then it is completely meaningless. Let's not continue with the heady ideal of what America is and forget the actuality of what we're experiencing.
Thank you, Ms. Nelson. We will now move to the final speech of the night, the opposing response.
Thank you, Mr. Spieldenner. I guess in the casinos they say that the house always wins, which is probably not good for me, but I was watching Ocean's 11 the other day, and that was very different. So, with that, I think that my first point is going to be there's a difference between failing and failed. We talked a lot about elements of where the United States is failing, but what constitutes definitive failure? And I think that there are two criteria we can use to constitute definitive failure. One was brought up by the esteemed Mr. Willie, which is an overthrow of the government. Have we had that in America? No, we have not. The second point is, one of the 5 criteria that we brought up has been completely and definitively lost. Have we had that in America? No, we have not. Therefore, we have not failed. The second point I would like to bring up is that we are arguing for freedom for the good. Now, we had a lot of very heady and also very important philosophy, and the basic arguments, it seems, are twofold.
1 minute remaining.
Wow. On the one side, that, well, comparing yourself to other countries doesn't make your premise known, doesn't prove it, which I'd like to point out that our comparisons were merely to show the fact that we in the United States are doing a very good job, not just better than the average Joe like Libya. But the other point is, where does freedom for the good lead us? Freedom for the good enshrined in the Constitution gives us the ability to choose that which is good. And as was many times brought up, the Founding Fathers had an innate understanding that Christianity, that godly living, was integral to that. If that was the case, therefore, given the freedom to actualize that in the system, we should still be in a Christian nation. But we're not. So we can conclude it is the fault of the people, not the fault of the structure. Thank you.
All right, now is the time. So we are going to vote. And for everybody who is standing up here, if you would just move into that half of the if you would like to be voted, social distance as you can. There seems to be space over there. But just so that our co-chair timer can come. So, if you affirm the motion that this House believes that the American experiment has failed, if you agree with that, please raise your hand. Yes, please stand, please stand. And then, if you can like,
Yeah, I was like...
All right, thank you, please sit. All right, if you oppose the motion that this House believes that the American experiment has failed, if you disagree with that statement, please raise your hand and stand. All right, wonderful. Please sit. Now, if you would like to abstain, if you neither oppose nor affirm, you are probably friends, but we'll get to that later. If you abstain, stand and raise your hand. All right. Okay, so we've got a couple announcements, so while we are counting the votes. So we would just like to thank everybody for coming, like to thank our presenters, and I would like to give a hand to the presenters. Debate. I appreciate everybody who contributed and everybody who wished to contribute and everybody who just watched. We are the Veritas Society. We promote the intellectual life of Franciscan on campus. If you are here, maybe for the first time, or you've been coming for 2 years, and you just really want to, have decided that you want to be a part of this, we have our associate program, which is in the back with the laptop. Eileen, if you could raise your hand. You'll see her for a small student-friendly fee. You can come to a lot of Veritas Associates events. You get a little thing like this. Our next event is March 11th, where we are going to I gotta check my notes. We have an evolution seminar with Dr. Bergsman. He presented at one of our debates last semester. And so if you would like to be a part of that, get into Veritas more, you're more than welcome. We also have the Gauntlet. Most of you know what that is. One of our the editor actually presented tonight. We have that at the door. And I've also been asked to promote, there is a book club of sorts, March 7th with Dr. Ware. I don't know when or where, you will see the posters. I don't know where. All right, I do believe we have the result. So.
Rita.
All right, with the final count, we have 40 votes affirming the motion. We have 48 votes opposing the motion. I announce this motion has failed.